He also quoted the brain damage factor and those sort of things. Um, I just want to speak in general terms, really, about my thoughts on the sport. I'm speaking to yourself, but I'm also just addressing anyone who may be watching this. Uh, for me, boxing is sort of a love-hate thing because I followed the sport for years. I buy Ring magazine. I watch fights on YouTube all the time. So clearly, I'm interested enough in favour of the sport to do that. You know, why would I spend £5 on a magazine if I hated it? Likewise, I go to a boxing gym, and I've got my sights on an amateur career. In my delusional state of mind, I see myself in Las Vegas in a world title fight, which will probably never happen. That's the reality. In boxing terms, I'm an old man. I'm 28, so I'm starting off pretty late. Um, Not unheard of, but it is late. In recent years, my interest in the sport has grown, but at the same time, I've found my scrutiny of the sport has grown. Now, if you look at YouTube videos, just type in boxing should be banned, um, they're utterly dwarfed by the number of fight videos. You know, the videos showing boxing should be banned, usually by doctors, sometimes by private individuals like yourself, maybe. The sort of viewership they get, and by the way, this is not a knock at yourself, this is just an observation, have a few hundred views. The fight videos have, in some cases, millions of views. So clearly there is still a huge public demand for boxing. Now, I know in the last 10 years MMA has posed serious competition to it, and anyone who follows martial arts will know that. I don't personally follow MMA, but I've recognised the serious threat it poses in business terms, in viewership terms, in popularity terms. Probably in the 2010s decade and the 2000s decade, it's been a more popular sport than boxing. However, boxing has a lot more history behind it, and I don't think that boxing is going to go anytime soon. Um, Even if you get a world title fight and a guy dies in the ring, I think there'll be a few months of massive controversy and then it'll go back to normal. I think so long as men are prepared to, I say men because it is predominantly men. I know there's women's boxing, but it is predominantly men. So long as people are prepared to put on gloves and throw the fist, boxing's it's going to exist. And it's a bit like any free will argument. The same would apply to prostitution, drug use, anything else that is a controversial subject, but to some or large extent involves free will. I do think we need to be a little bit careful about that because there is dubious areas. I mean, in parts of Latin America, young men basically have no other choice but to fight for financial purposes. For them, it is financial. It's either that or face a life of crime. The same applies to some inner city areas in the United States, and I suspect in the UK as well. Traditionally, boxing has been a working class sport, so it's undeniable that there's a financial aspect to it. A lot of young men have turned to boxing to get out of poverty. So the free will thing is, we have to be careful about that. Although, having said that, it is true that no one is actually forcing fighters to fight. For the most part, you may get pushy fathers, but for the most part, guys who step into the ring want to do it. I would honestly say 98% of the time. It's true that there's guys who are deluding themselves, or fighting too long and so on. That sadly is too often the case, but that fundamental free will that the fighter chooses to fight is there. You can take all the corruption boxing, you can take all the flaws with it, but that is a fundamental truth. I mean, that might sound inconsistent with what I've just said about it being used as a financial escape route, but even then, all those young guys actually like it anyway. that's an important point to recognise. You do raise some important points. I mean, you say the purpose of this sport is to hurt your opponent. Well, that's true on some level, but it also misses another point. Um, a lot of boxers will say cruelty is inevitable in this sport. There is an intention of hurting your opponent because you have to do that in order to win the fight. But most fighters, I would say, honestly don't actually want to hurt their opponent. They just want to win the fight, but they have to hurt their opponent in order to do it. I mean, you're sort of implying that boxers are sadistic people and they like violence. Now, obviously, when you get someone like Mike Tyson and some of the sort of statements he's come out with, it does very much feed into that stereotype. And not just Tyson, there's other guys out there who have that sort of persona. But it's unfair to generalise boxers. I would make that point. If you look at a fight like Joe Calzaghe, this is just an example. He said, no matter what you think, I never went into a fight with that sort of intention. I wanted to win. I never wanted to actually hurt my opponent. And very often, unquestionably, there's cruelty in the sport in the context of what a fight is. But very, very often you'll see a fighter go to his opponent at the end of the fight and embrace that guy in a hug. If quite often you'll see, if a guy is on the canvas, quite often their opponent will go over and make sure they're okay. So it's true that during the fight there is intention there of hurting an opponent in order to win the fight. But the idea that all boxers are sadistic, I think is very unfair. And it is overlooking that factor, that actually a lot of fighters are good sportsmen. I mean, you really can't compare boxing to a savage street fight where guys really do try to kill each other. For example, in a race riot or something like that. It's true that world title fights, speaking plainly, in that context, it is fair to say that boxers are modern day gladiators. And even though the sport has drastically improved its safety, the fact remains men can die in the ring. But I guess from a boxer's perspective, they would argue, well, you could go out tomorrow and be hit by a car. You could die as a passive smoker. If you always go into a bar where there's lots of smokers, there's so many scenarios in this world where you can die. That's the way the world is. The world is not a safe place. So boxers would argue, I would argue, that by subjecting yourself to danger, you're actually preparing yourself for a tough world. My own logic, as someone who is wanting to get involved in this, I don't want to hurt another man. I really don't want to. What I do want to know that I can take physical punishment. Because there may well come a day when I need to protect my wife and my family, or my girlfriend. So I look at it as maybe a traditional concept of being prepared as a man. And this is not saying that guys who don't fight are not men. Please don't read it that way. That's not what I'm saying. Just in my own personal motivation, I feel I need to test myself in that environment to know if I can handle the real thing. I am someone who has had experience in my life of gangs. I've had experience of guys assaulting me in the street for no other reason than they're just thugs, and I was the nearest person. I was an easy target, whatever. I remember the humiliation. I remember the fear. There's no point being bravado. It did scare me. It did intimidate me. I remember being frightened to leave my own house. I lived in an inner city area. And that had a deep impact on my life. I only wish I'd done boxing a lot earlier. But to simply sort of imply that boxers are just sadistic people, to sort of dehumanize boxers in that way, I think it's very unfair. Boxers are a diverse group of people, as much as any other group of people. And if you don't believe that, please just go to interviews, look up personal profiles, etc. of fighters. It's true you'll find some general trends, but you will also find a very wide range of personalities there. There's guys in boxing I despise. There's guys in boxing I admire. There's good guys, there's bad guys. There's guys who are in it for the money. There's guys who are in it for the titles. So it is unfair to sort of vilify boxers in that way. You mentioned, for example, Floyd Mayweather and domestic violence, and unfortunately there are quite a lot of fighters who have that sort of record. But to then sort of imply that all fighters are like that, it's very unfair. You could probably find that in any sport. You could probably find people with unsavory characters. By the same token, and I believe I put this on your video, and this is not a personal attack against yourself, it's just to try and clarify this. Take these three world-class fighters: Lennox Lewis, Sergio Martinez, and Vladimir Klitschko. They're three world title fighters, great fighters. They've all held world championships, right? All three men have publicly condemned violence against women. Klitschko done it in his press conference with Derek Chisora, who was a British boxer who'd been accused of domestic violence. Klitschko publicly said a man who hits a woman is not a real man. He used that press conference to raise that issue. Lennox Lewis worked with British police to make a public relations commercial about domestic violence. And I know the Argentine boxer Sergio Martinez has been very active in this, because unfortunately in Latin America that is a big problem. So to say that boxers are all woman beaters, I think that's very, very unfair. I'm going to be a boxer, and the idea of beating a female is just alien to me. So that's unfair to castigate boxers in that way. Of course there are guys like that, but like I say, you would get that in any field in life. In fact, one reason that I want to do, if I ever go far in the sport, I want to promote a good image. And that might sound like a contradiction. Like, people out there will be saying, well, how can you promote a good image in a violent sport? It's hypocritical. I don't think it is, actually, because there's an equilibrium there. When you're facing another man in the ring, you're facing another professional athlete. Or if I'm an amateur, I'm facing someone who's at the same level. It's true that there's a lot of fights you can pick out that are outmatched, but nevertheless they're still both professionals. They've still trained for the fights. They've still been approved by Boxing Board of Controls, and they wouldn't get a license to fight if they were not prepared. So that's a very important thing to recognise. It's not like these are just two guys from the street who've just been picked up and said, oh, okay, let's fight. So there really is a lot of things to consider. In fact, there's so many things I really want to raise. I don't really have time in the time frame of this video, but I'll try and include what I can. Like I say, I don't want to be... I personally also have serious reservations about the sport. I think I'll make a second video, actually. This is important because I don't want to be a hypocrite. I do recognise a lot of the points you're making, Bruce, and this isn't just for your video, it's just my general thoughts. I do agree with some of the points you're making. In terms of health, I think anyone who's honest in this sport cannot say that being hit on the head repeatedly is healthy. The human head is not designed for that. So as someone who follows the sport, I fully concede that. But some of the world's best boxers, and Mayweather would be a good example actually, are defensive. This sport is not just about hitting your opponent, it's also about defense. And one of the first things the referee says is protect yourself at all times. So you'll get a guy like Mayweather who looks unscathed. He's had 46 professional fights. He still looks, in boxing terms, he's getting older now, but he's still quite a good looking guy. He doesn't look like your stereotype boxer, cauliflower ear and thick nose and all that sort of thing. But I guess that's just because he's been lucky. I'm not going to lie. I have reservations about sport where the contact is constantly about hitting someone on the head. You get body blows as well, but it's entirely on the upper part of the body and the head. Now, MMA, to its credit, is focused on the whole body. In that sense, you don't need to be a genius to work out that is safer, because there's a lot less impact to the human brain. It's a lot more impact on parts of the body that can easily heal. So I admit I do have reservations about that. And I have seen fighters, not personally, but I've seen fighters, I've heard of fighters who have come. I mean, Ali is always quoted, but he's not even the worst example. I would quote maybe Gerald McClellan, who's now blind, in a wheelchair, and he wasn't exactly the most likable of fighters. He was not a pleasant individual, but that's beside the point. To see any man in that condition, it's very sad. And as a boxing fan, I feel very, very uneasy about that. There's been many other examples of fighters who've been left in concussion. They've had to go to hospital the same night. I would say one thing though. The vast majority of fighters come out, I wouldn't say unscathed, but you have to recognise that for every fight that has had a serious injury or issues with brain damage and so on, there's been probably at least several hundred more fights that haven't. Every day across the world there is probably, I wouldn't like to put a figure on it, but probably hundreds of amateur and professional fights every single day. And the vast majority of those, the fighters will come out relatively okay. They'll be tired, maybe have a few cuts, but it's actually, individual fights is actually quite rare that there'll be serious injuries. Because nowadays the sport is a lot more regulated. That's a good thing. So in that sense, boxing is a lot safer from previous decades. But that doesn't mean that I'm glossing over the real health risks that do exist. And at this point I'm going to go on to another video, so please keep up to date and look out for part 2. Thanks.